recording this, which I just clicked on. So if you have any problems with that, feel free to disconnect. Otherwise, we'll have this available for folks to refer to and to share with your friends, colleagues, and family members for the holidays. It can be their holiday gift. At a later time, we'll upload it to a YouTube channel that Campus Compact of the Mountain West maintains. And we'll send you the link to that along with this set of slides that we'll be going through today, and a short evaluation following the webinar. So I'll mention this a couple of times. Don't worry if there is a lot on a slide and we are moving through it at a quicker clip than you would like, because you will have access to all of this information following the webinar, in addition to contact information for our wonderful facilitators who I will introduce in a moment. So you'll have lots of opportunities to dig in a little bit deeper to the content, and if you would like to follow up with anybody whose face you can see on this webinar today. So a big welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephanie Schooley. I am with Campus Compact of the Mountain West. We are the Campus Compact affiliate working primarily in Colorado and Wyoming. And for this webinar series, we've been partnering with California Campus Compact as well. So you may have seen their logo on the announcement going out. Campus Compact is a national organization that is a membership organization of higher education institutions. And really our reason for being is to help articulate the public good purposes of higher education. So really to look at civic and community engagement opportunities and ways that we can support the development of colleges and universities across the country that are really deeply connected to their local communities and are providing those opportunities for connections for students, creating meaningful partnerships within the community, etc. We are delighted today to be able to highlight some research that has come out of the University of Denver in partnership with the Colorado Department of Education. And I'm going to let Kara and Cody introduce themselves in more detail. Before we get started, let me give you a little bit of an overview of Zoom. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, there is one primary way in which you all will be able to post comments and to ask questions. We'll have some time set outside at the end of the presentation for you all to ask questions to Cody and to Kara about their research and about sort of application and next steps for this research and exciting ways in which you may be able to use this at your institution, or if you're a community partner with the campus that you partner with. If you click on the Q&A button, you can post questions and comments in that box, and we will include those in the Q&A for the last 15 or so minutes of this webinar. So please, throughout the webinar, post your questions and comments, and we'll make sure that your voice is heard through that mechanism. Again, if you need any technical assistance, you can post in the chat box, or you can send me an email. I'm at stephanie@ccmountainwest.org. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kara Diano, who works at the University of Denver as the Associate Director in their Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning, affectionately called CECL. And they are a wonderful partner with Campus Compact of the Mountain West and a partner with the Colorado Department of Education. And Cody Buchanan, who is our co-facilitator today, is a community partnership specialist. And both Kara and Cody also are very active members of the Colorado Service Learning Council, and you will hear all about that through their presentation they're about to give. So, Cody and Kara, off to the races.
All right. Well, thanks, Stephanie, for the introductions. So we'll dive right into the webinar here based on some research that the Colorado Service Learning Council, which Stephanie mentioned, that both Cody and I sit on the coordinating committee for, and sort of how this research evolved out of conversations that were a part of that group, and what our findings were. So we'll start with a quick introduction. So I'll tell you a little bit about the research partners. So I'm with the University of Denver's Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning. And our center's mission is to educate, engage, and equip the campus community. So we're really charged with ensuring that the University of Denver is working towards its vision of being a great private university dedicated to the public good. To accomplish our work, we think about 4 primary initiative areas. That's service, civic development, community engaged learning, and community engaged scholarship. And the work that we do through those initiatives is grounded in the lens of community organizing. So while a lot of the work that we undertake isn't community organizing per se, we use that as the framework, the approach, the philosophy by which we train faculty, staff, and students to do really high quality community partnerships that are truly reciprocal, looking at root causes, are thinking about creating long-term lasting change, shifting and renegotiating dynamics of power, talking about privilege, oppression, and identity. Those are the kinds of things that we try to incorporate in our approach to community engagement and service learning. So that's a little bit about who we are. The website's up there if you're curious to know more. And I'll let Cody talk a little bit more about who the Colorado Service Learning Council is.
So the Colorado Service Learning Council is a collaborative organization comprised of community-based organizations, state agencies, and higher ed institutions around the state who are all kind of working together to support high-quality service learning in all of those contexts statewide. We've adopted a modified version of the constellation model where we have small constellations or subcommittees that work in specialized areas as determined by our annual priority setting meeting. We're going to talk a little bit later at the end of the presentation about how you can get involved if you'd like with the Colorado Service Learning Council. But our current constellations are communication, networking, advocacy, and the coordinating constellation, which serves as our steering committee. And a little bit of background on how this whole project kind of got started. In 2014, 6 organizations with a civic focus around in Colorado began working with the National Conference on Citizenship to develop the Colorado Civic Health Index. When the index revealed how residents in the state engage in important civic activities, such as voting, volunteering, even interacting with their neighbors. And this type of engagement is really critical because it's linked to the both economic and personal health of individuals and the greater community. Overall, the report finds that Colorado's civic health is strong, but seeing really varying levels of civic participation across communities. Through the report, they highlighted several kind of calls to action, and we at the Service Learning Council really believe that service learning can be a great response to some of the calls to action outlined in the Civic Health Index. We also hope to serve as a kind of a innovative to build innovative collaborations throughout the kind of education and greater community around service learning to kind of support some of the work that is being done by the Civic Health Index and those folks.
So at one of the meetings for the Civic Health Index, we were hosting a roundtable. The Service Learning Council was hosting a roundtable. And the conversation revolved around what do we know about service learning and how does it help us tackle these gaps in civic health that we might be talking about. And so what we started to discuss was the fact that we know a relatively large amount of information about the impact of service learning on students. We know a little bit, clearly not nearly as much as we might like, about the impact on communities. But in terms of the impact on practitioners themselves, the folks who are designing and implementing service learning classes and projects, we actually know very little. So that gave us sort of this seed of an idea, the context. Coupling that with the recognition that there has been in recent years a call for both K-12 and higher education to return to that historic civic mission that's really embedded in our education system. And so with that, we'll also talk about sort of what folks have been saying in the literature about service learning.
So service learning has been really clearly established as one of three powerful pedagogies to promote civic learning in a crucible moment, and one of the proven practices, very alliterative, identified for effective civic learning in the K-12 space. So really looking at the need to continue advocating for service learning as an approach, and we've really looked at this project as part of helping to support that advocacy by highlighting the benefits on practitioners.
So with all of this background, we were thinking that there's not much known about practitioners. We know that service learning is a powerful pedagogy, a proven practice. Apparently, we like peas, as well as a return to the historic civic mission. We looked at the literature, and indeed, the survey says that there is a lot of information about the impact on students, little impact about communities, and almost nothing about the impact on practitioners. Now, there is some research on practitioners, but the vast majority of it doesn't focus on the individual practitioner impacts on them. So we know a bit about what the barriers and challenges are, as well as what might motivate a faculty member or a K-12 teacher, a nonprofit provider, in enabling them to initiate service learning. But again, nothing about the impacts. There's even been a research study on the characteristics of faculty members who are more likely to engage in service learning, information about how to approach professional development programs for individuals who want to learn about service learning, information about students' perceptions of the teachers who are using service learning as a pedagogy in their classrooms. And then much of the research, when we look at impact on practitioners, focuses again less on them as individuals and more on their satisfaction with student learning outcomes. So we do know a bit about practitioners, but nothing that's really allows us to see the direct impact on them as individuals.
And I think this becomes particularly important in the K-12 space, as we've seen over the last 5 years a real reduction in kind of system level support for service learning. In 2010, the Learn and Serve grant, which was a federal grant that for many years funded service learning throughout the country, it went away. So since that grant dried up, or those funds dried up, we've seen a real kind of reduction in service learning opportunities available in K-12, kind of coupled with the increased focus on literacy, math, as the real focus areas of evaluation and assessment, and knowing that service learning is a little harder to quantify as far as those benefits. So it's become particularly important to be able to highlight where there are benefits, because teachers who are hoping to adopt a service learning approach face an uphill battle.
So that gives at least a quick overview of how we arrived at a gap in the literature that we decided we might be able to tackle something about. So I'll tell you a little bit about the methods, and then hopefully we'll spend most of the conversation diving into a discussion about what our findings. So we decided that engaging in just a small-scale exploratory study would be a good first start, using qualitative methods to conduct interviews with practitioners that were relatively diverse. So we were looking for folks who are using service learning in the nonprofit sector, K-12 teachers, faculty at higher education institutions, and our goal was to accomplish 20 interviews. We ended up conducting 22 interviews. However, one of the interviewees, while she was at an organization that used service learning, she herself had not created, implemented, or engaged in a service learning project or class. So we ended up having to sort of toss her interview out, since we were trying to focus on that personal experience of practitioners. So we ended up with 21 valid interviews, and we recruited folks through the Service Learning Council. So the Service Learning Council has a pretty rich network of individuals who are, fortunately, as a small organization, are still based mostly in the metro area, but we do have folks who come from other parts of the state. When I say metro area, I mean Denver area. But we do have some folks who are other parts of the state who are involved as well. So we started with emails to members to invite them to participate. announcements at quarterly meetings, and we used snowball sampling. So when we reached out to those folks, we asked them for suggestions of other individuals in their network who might be willing and interested in participating in an interview about their experience having led a service learning practice, project, or component. And we let participants self-identify as service learning practitioners. So we didn't provide a definition in our recruitment that said, you know, if you've done the following, then you're eligible for the interview. So we allowed folks to define it in whatever way was meaningful for them. And that was one of our first interview questions, was to understand more about how they define service learning, to make sure that the group of individuals we were talking to sort of made sense to look at them collectively. So here's a quick overview of the breakdown of the individuals that we ended up interviewing. And for a small scale study, we had a pretty good diversity in terms of institution type, as well as years of experience, how they learned about service learning, how they became trained in using it in the first place. It might be worth noting as well that all of the 6 nonprofit practitioners noted here, all of them worked with K-12 students. So while our K-12 folks were teachers in a school, there were 4 different schools represented there and 4 different higher education institutions represented in that number. Nonprofits, it was 6 unique individuals from 6 different organizations. So we had a pretty good diversity. Not surprisingly, we're more female heavy than male. That's pretty common in our field of community engagement and service learning to see that. But I felt pretty good about the sort of spread of experience and diversity in our pool of interview applicants.
Yeah, I got it. So what we really looked at was the 4 first bullets you see there were our kind of primary impacts that we were most interested in examining. So we were very careful to frame the questions so that we didn't suppose an impact in the way that we framed the question, but really trying to dig in on the impacts that service learning had on the individual who was facilitating or running a service learning, on their teaching or their ability to reach students and deliver content, their relationships with students, other instructors, the administrators in their institution and their institution in general, and then their own civic engagement, which I found particularly interesting. And then kind of on a secondary, we looked a little bit at student outcomes, and then some of the outcomes for the school, institution, department, or organization. And the researchers met with the coordinating committee of the Colorado Service Learning Council to determine and finalize the interview questions that would be most appropriate, both for the work of Cecil here and also the work of the council.
So now we'll dive into the results. And we found results that were direct impact on practitioners in 3 primary categories. We also identified indirect impacts, which you saw on the last slide based on those questions, that seem to be relatively important to practitioners as well. So there's a lot of impacts that you'll see on the slide here, and we won't have time to dive into each of these individually today. So we selected a handful of impacts that we thought might be most compelling to tell you about, but we've included a slide for each of them so that you will have the information. So if it looks like I'm moving really quickly through the slides, it's because we're skipping over a couple that you'll have in your handouts, but that we're not going to focus on today. So we'll start with the ones I've circled here are the ones that we will highlight. So we're going to cover all of the pedagogical implications, a couple of the personal implications, and one of the relational implications that we found. We're going to skip over indirect impacts, but I'll touch briefly on them as we cover those. So we'll start with the pedagogical impacts. And so the first that I want to talk about is the knowledge of student learning process. So a large number of individuals that we interviewed, the practitioners, really talked about how through using service learning as a teaching pedagogy, they became aware of students as holistic individuals, really understanding their learning process. So not just what they were learning, but how they were learning it and how they could encourage students to deepen that learning. They were able to advocate for students because of their understanding of the learning process as well. So really it led us to the key finding that you'll see here, that advocating for students and really understanding how to develop courses and assignments and projects that could take a diversity of students into account. And another thing that I want to say before I move on that I forgot to note earlier. So we'll talk about an overview. We've also tried to provide an illustrative quote at the bottom of each of our slides to just share with you the kinds of things that our practitioners were saying. And in our trying to be catchy, we made them red if it was higher ed, and we made them purple if it was a K-12 person. So if you're curious to know where the quotes came from. But none of our findings demonstrated that there was a strong difference between, say, higher ed and K-12 folks. It might be an area for further exploration to see what nuances there might be. Other than some of the ways that higher ed folks and K-12 folks talk about service learning and the like really vital components, there was a little bit of difference there in terms of higher ed folks talk about the really truly reciprocal community partnerships as being really important. And K-12 folks talk about youth voice more than they talk about community partnerships. So they youth voice is a vital component for them in ensuring that students have a role to play in the development of the service learning project. So the next benefit that we'll highlight is this stronger sense of the practitioner's ability to communicate theory effectively to students. And so we saw that 12 of our 21 interviewees really talked about in some way how they were able to make academic concepts come alive for students, how they could use not only the current experience that students are having with the service learning component, but also their past experiences as practitioners who have taught previous service learning courses that allowed them to use those examples as sorts of case studies in class to help further and deepen students' understanding of the theory that they were trying to communicate. And they felt like it allowed students to grapple more deeply with the topics that they were trying to cover through readings and lectures and other sort of classroom-based activities by engaging in service learning.
I would just say, you can really see how this finding, along with the last, with kind of acknowledging differentiated learning styles, you can really start to see how service learning can supplement and really help students from a variety of different kind of learning styles develop and acquire some of these academic content.
And then the third and final pedagogical impact that we discovered that almost all of our practitioners talked about was an enhanced use of constructivist teaching styles. So we thought about or defined constructivist teaching, as you'll see here, typified by active student-centered classrooms. Really rethinking, sort of renegotiating who has knowledge in the room and how do students come into the classroom with knowledge to share and expertise to share, rethinking about what does authority in the classroom look like, and how do we create these spaces where we're all learning together, including the teacher or faculty member as well. And so lots of folks talked about service learning as a great way to sort of flip that traditional banking model away from that and into a space that really felt reciprocal with the students themselves. And you'll see here a great quote from one of our K-12 practitioners who was talking about that, really getting away from doing things just because the teacher wants them to, but really learning more deeply. So now we'll talk a little bit about personal implications. So we're just going to cover 2 of the 4 today, but I'll talk really briefly about the other 2 that aren't starred and highlighted there for you. It became really clear really quickly. Every practitioner had some intrinsic value that they took from leading service learning. We heard all kinds of things like a sense of satisfaction, it's rewarding, I'm leaving a legacy. So this really strong, emotionally rooted sense that this was important and valuable work that seemed to have an impact on practitioners. And then to a lesser extent, though it still seemed important for folks, there was a conversation by many individuals about how their engagement with service learning had led to rewards or recognition and possibly promotion and tenure for some faculty through that process. And so the being recognized for the work, some of it was formal, so receiving an actual formal award, and some of it was informal, where individuals felt that they had elevated their stance and their discipline by participating in service learning, or that the impact of the work that they'd done had become more widespread through their service learning teaching. So we're not going to focus on those today. I'll skip through those slides and we'll focus on engagement and commitment to teaching next.
I think this is a really huge one. As you see, 18 of the 21 interviewees felt that being a part of a service learning curriculum or facilitating service learning had a positive impact on their commitment to teaching. As we know, teacher retention is a huge issue nationwide, particularly in Colorado. Since 2009, we've seen a real steady increase in teacher turnover. Last year, 17% of teachers left the classroom after last year. So almost a fifth of teachers are turning over every year. And when you think about, how important it is for teachers to have that kind of experience and to have our kind of educators kind of stick with it and feel that sense of value, service learning can be really important for that. Only 30% of teachers felt engaged in their work, which is another really kind of staggering number when you think about it. And so I think, service learning can be really valuable to teacher retention.
And I think this one is interesting to me too, because at first blush, it might appear that this engagement and commitment to teaching is a pedagogical impact, but it really, for the way that our practitioners talked about it, was this sense that they were in the right field and discipline for them, that it was a right fit for who they were personally, their professional aspirations. So it was interesting to see that so many practitioners talked about this. So the next impact that we'll talk about is impact on personal civic engagement. And in some ways, I found this to be one of the more surprising impacts that we discovered. So while some of our practitioners talked about how engaging in service learning really did deepen their personal commitment to and involvement in community issues, most of them actually expressed that service learning is how they accomplish their own personal sense of civic engagement and being involved civically. A lot of them talk about how doing this work is hard and challenging and tough. And so at the end of the day, while they sometimes grapple with maybe I should be doing more, that they feel like by having this avenue through their professional careers to accomplish the kind of community change they want to see, that they feel really satisfied with that. So they feel satisfied personally and professionally by being able to do this. So again, it was a little bit mixed, but I would say, I wouldn't say, I know that most of our practitioners talked about really the civic engagement that they get from leading service learning as their primary way that they engage and involve themselves in the community. All right, so I'll turn it over to Cody to talk about relational impacts.
And I think that this really, again, feeds into that teacher satisfaction conversation, because, looking at going through the service learning process with students and how it really increases the relationships that educators are having with their students, with other administrators, with other instructors, but really want to focus on the stronger relationships with students, because that's a really important part, especially in the K-12 setting for dropout prevention. Student engagement is a really, it's getting an increased focus recently, looking at how we can have an education system that is more engaging for our students, and understanding that students are whole people. I think part of the relationship building, as it says here, breaks down the hierarchy and the balance of power, but it opens students up to learning a lot of the kind of what we call non-cognitive skills or soft skills, and I'm not a big fan of either one of those terms. But when you look at things like leadership and teamwork and communication and time management, those are things that it's hard to deliver as a part of a curriculum, much easier as a part of an experience. And when you have a great relationship with your teacher, you're much more open to learning those things. So what Kara mentioned earlier, the youth voice part of youth voice is really integral to service learning in the K-12 setting, really giving youth the opportunity to develop that sense of agency and take control of their own education. That happens very rarely in traditional classroom settings where youth are given the opportunity to take a leadership role. And as education moves more towards project-based learning, the relationship with students is going to be increasingly important. So looking at service learning as a key to developing strong relationships between teachers and students is very important.
So we're not going to touch too much on this, but I'll just say briefly that many practitioners talked about the benefits that they feel like having a cohort of other instructors who are also engaging in service learning pedagogy, especially across disciplines. So it allows them to feel connected at their institutions in ways that are relatively unique, by not around a disciplinary focus or some sense of expertise, but around a pedagogy and how they're choosing to engage their students. When we think about relationships with administrators, they tend to be pretty mixed. So some folks report that they are able to enhance their relationships, others say they struggle. So it's a little bit mixed with practitioners feeling that if they engage in service learning, whether or not they're supported or whether or not it jeopardizes their relationship with administrators. And then a number of interviewees also mentioned that they strengthen relationships with community organizations, with individuals in community organizations, some on a professional level and some on a more personal level, so that there was value placed in the ability to make those relationships with other individuals who are passionate about similar topics and activities in the community as well. So the last category of benefits was not the direct impact that we were initially looking for, but when we talked to practitioners, they all talked about these indirect impacts that then in turn influence their sense of satisfaction with the pedagogy and their willingness to continue to teach service learning using service learning methods. And so all of the practitioners, not surprisingly, talk about students and their learning. So the impact that service learning has on the students themselves and their ability to learn the classroom content. They also talk about the impact that their willingness to engage in service learning pedagogy has on important public problems that matter to them as individuals, that they care about, the practitioners. And they also talked about how service learning has an impact on their perceptions of and their relationship with their institution. So many of them, though not all, talked about how engaging in service learning for some of their organizations has really become a touch point that they choose to highlight. Several of the K-12 schools in particular talked about how they differentiate themselves from other schools in their district by having teachers who focus on service learning. Other individuals talk about how their work with service learning has, led to the institution receiving some really great public relations and media attention for the impact that their service learning work has. So they see it as having a shifting. A way of shifting their relationship and perceptions of their own institutions. So I'm going to click through those slides so that we can get to a discussion of what does this all mean. So we know that there are pedagogical impacts that impact practitioners, the personal impacts, relational impacts, and then those indirect impacts that I was just talking about. So the really nice thing I think about our findings is that when we look back at that research that I was talking about at the start of our presentation about what's been studied about what motivates individuals to engage in service learning in the first place, well, it turns out that the things that motivate them to get involved in service learning are the actual impacts that they feel when they lead service learning. So it's really great to see in terms of the pedagogical impacts that we were talking about. There's been studies that demonstrate that faculty engage in this kind of work because they have curricular concerns. They want to ensure that students are learning the breadth and depth of the content that they want to be covering in their particular discipline. They want to ensure that students are learning the course material and learning it really well. They want to ensure that they're really connecting their students to how this information applies to real world problems, to really being able to take it beyond the classroom. And service learning allows them to do these things. The personal impacts that folks have, or personal motivations that individuals have studied that we also saw in our research really, are looking at things again like faculty sense of civic engagement, or that intrinsic value that folks place, or the rewards symbols and other things similar to that. So again, those rewards, recognition, and opportunities for promotion that occur. And then some of the motivation research has also focused on the relational aspect, as again, our research found. Demonstrated that individuals are motivated to get involved in this, to develop stronger relationships with their community, really develop interesting relationships with institutional leaders, and organizational values and mission that you'll see there from some work done by Omira, as well as developing relationships with other instructors at their institutions, really feeling that sense of network and support, whether it's within their discipline or across disciplines. So that was great to see that what we actually found and what practitioners feel they receive as benefits from service learning is tied to why they want to engage in service learning in the first place. So why does this all matter? We'll turn it over to Cody to talk a little bit about some of that.
I think it's really important to keep in mind that while all of these awesome benefits are happening for the teacher, obviously the students are also receiving a tremendous benefit by participating in service learning projects. But knowing that engaged teachers are more satisfied personally and professionally, knowing that they have kind of a venue to enhance their own skills while they develop authentic relationships with the students that they serve, as well as enhancing their relationships within their institutions. All of these things kind of coming together really highlight the reason or help teachers see why it would be important or why it could be really beneficial for them to engage in service learning. As I said earlier, there's not a lot of support at the institutional or at the systems level for service learning. And while particular schools have done a great job to focus on, and I'm talking about K-12 schools, really focused on, we see pockets where they've really focused on service learning. For a teacher who isn't at an institution that focuses on service learning, if they want to undergo a service learning project, they're going to face some challenges. They're going to have to find some funding. They're going to have to kind of scour the community for project ideas and partnership opportunities. And ultimately, it goes really outside of their traditional curriculum model. So it will be extra work. So I think it's really important for the service learning community to continue to communicate with those teachers about why it behooves them as individuals as well as their students to undergo service learning. This stat here, I think, is really eye-opening as well. Seeing that those teachers who are engaged in their jobs or less engaged in their jobs report twice as many absences on average as those who aren't. And knowing that service learning can be such an awesome way to feel engaged with your job, there's a correlation between service learning and teacher presence and being, in the classroom and lowering the rate of substitute teachers who we know are never quite as effective. So I think that, that really gets back to why the council was really interested in this research in the first place, because we see advocacy as one of our major charges, and looking at how we can advocate in the larger community, seeing that we've seen some real awesome focus on service learning in our higher ed institutions. It seems like over the last 10, 15 years, service learning has really, the profile of service learning has really risen in higher ed institutions around the state and around the country. And to see that hasn't, that K-12 is kind of trending the opposite way. For me in the K-12 space, it really underscores the need to help promote service learning and make resources and connections available, support for teachers who are looking to implement service learning. That's what we've really seen is our main kind of sweet spot of the council is networking and advocacy. So how do we bring teachers who are looking to implement service learning together with organizations and individuals that have the resources and expertise to support that? That's been one of our real successes, is bringing together those folks. And even Karen and I have had some awesome kind of connections that have happened just through our participation in the council that have opened the door to literally hundreds of students in Denver now working through service learning projects with the support of Kara's students here at the Center for Service Learning and Community Engagement and Service Learning.
Yeah, I can't underscore at least the benefit for me personally being involved in the Service Learning Council. It's been a great way to connect with folks outside of higher education who are doing service learning, for me to develop a more holistic understanding of what service learning looks like in K-12 and nonprofit, how other folks in the community are talking about it, how we can collaborate. And as Cody mentioned, he was able to connect me with one of his contacts at one of the local high schools. That's now blossomed into a pretty amazing partnership between my institution and that local high school, where we're supporting 15 classes at the high school, sending in university students who are teaching service learning components and advisory curriculum in partnership with teachers there. So it's an exciting sort of pilot program for us, and I don't think it would have happened if it hadn't been for the connection that we made through the council. So the council's been around for about 4 or 5 years, though really only started to catch steam in the last couple. And we're hoping that more folks become aware of who we are and the work that we do and how we collaborate and build networks. And I'd also say the research that we did here, it wouldn't have been possible without the council either. To have this interesting and rich network of service learning practitioners from different sectors, different levels of experience, was only because of the members of the council who were able to suggest those folks. So the last thing that we really wanted to talk about before we wrap up and get to questions is, what are the implications of this research? What does this mean in particular for individuals who want to champion service learning at their institutions, really think about embedding this work into the fabric of their organizations so that it's a priority? So we have a couple of suggestions based on what we learned from talking to our practitioners. And so, of course, talking about service learning is a high impact practice, which we already know from some prior work, but that it not only leads to vibrant outcomes for students, but it does develop the skills of those who are leading service learning as well, right? So we have a stronger holistic picture when we can talk about not only the students and the community partners involved, but often the impacts on the practitioners themselves. I think in the absence of that information, lots of people fill in the blanks. So in my experience, there's all kinds of stories about how ridiculously challenging it's going to be, or how it's going to impact tenure and promotion processes, or how it might challenge somebody to be able to advance in their discipline or for their work to be recognized. And I think at least having some information about what the actual impacts are, rather than these sort of wild assumptions sometimes, could be really helpful. So I also think that in terms of how we support existing practitioners or those who are interested in getting involved in service learning, we can really think about how we can share with them that it's an opportunity to expand their relationships, not only with other instructors on campus if they're attending professional development opportunities, but deepening their relationships with students, really developing relationships with individuals in the community. I think that can be really helpful to folks to know that there'll be a tangible impact in terms of their relationships that comes out of engaging in service learning pedagogy. And then I also think for folks like me who lead service learning on a college campus, creating those inter and cross-disciplinary cohorts seems to be really important to individuals, and they place a lot of value on having had an experience to connect with individuals that they might not have otherwise had, that they connected through service learning. So I think we can also talk with practitioners about how engaging in service learning is a way to connect your professional expertise to something that you're personally passionate about, and really playing up that it can be an opportunity to really live out a civic engagement philosophy. So if you find it challenging to find it in your spare time, that you can actually apply that passion for civic engagement and creating community change professionally through using service learning. I think that, you know, in terms of advocating with key institutional leaders, one would assume that it's important to them to retain high quality individuals at their institution who are engaged and committed to their work. So when we can talk about service learning as a way to reinvigorate individuals who are teaching, I think that can be helpful. And I was surprised by the number of individuals who not only talked about service learning as like sort of finding this niche that worked for them, but several individuals talked about the fact that they were burning out and considering leaving the field of teaching until they found service learning, and that it really kept them engaged, involved, and committed to the work that they did, even if it was challenging and had its difficulties. So I think it's a nice way to recognize that we see the challenges and barriers, but there are some strong benefits that come from this work. I mentioned earlier, it's nice to supplement the existing literature about what we know on impacts on students, to have an understanding of the impacts on practitioners as well, so we have that clear, holistic understanding. And I think, you know, to a little bit of a lesser extent, while it wasn't mentioned quite as frequently, it was helpful for folks to have their work be recognized and valued and to be rewarded. And it didn't seem like it had to be some big and flashy award. Small ways that we can recognize the work that they do and really think about that can be really helpful to individuals to know that it's valuable and worth pursuing. So the last thing that I wanted to say before we open it up for questions, and we're happy to answer any questions folks might have. I can talk about limitations of the research if you're curious, or ideas for future research that we have, is just to say that we are under final review for publishing this research study in a book chapter format in the Handbook of Research on Community Engagement in 21st Century Education. And so that should be coming out in 2016, and all seems to be moving well and moving forward. Sarah Plummer-Taylor, who's the co-author of that book chapter, was a graduate student who worked with us on the research that we conducted and really is responsible, and we owe a great debt of gratitude for her work in interviewing all of the practitioners and really playing a strong role. So with that, we'll turn it over to questions, and feel free to contact us post-webinar if you want any further information as well.
Or if you'd like to learn more about the council or get involved with our work on the Service Learning Council.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, Kara and Cody. And we've got questions that are sort of micro and macro. So one, I'm just going to answer really quickly for someone that asked about some resources around platforms for instructors to share about service learning models and essentially sort of to increase efficiency around some of that additional burden and planning out and implementing service learning courses. So there are a lot of resources around that are both locally and nationally. And so for you, Maureen, who asked that question, we'll add a final slide to the PowerPoint that we'll be sending out after the webinar, which some of those websites that you can start sort of digging into to look into different ways in which folks are kind of leveraging the best practices and experiences, both positive and negative, perhaps the learning opportunities from that other people have already kind of gone through, that hopefully will help with some of that initial feeling. And we talk about this a lot during the Engaged Faculty Institute facilitator training around, you know, what are those points at which instructors, whether it's K-12 or higher education, hit that sort of stop out point, like, oh, this is too much work, this feels very overwhelming. And there are a lot of resources to, I think, help with that, to create some flow during those points. So we'll make sure that we include some of those resources on this PowerPoint.
I'll also just throw out that the Colorado Service Learning Council has a website, coloradoservicelearning.org, and we have a lot of really great resources on the website broken out by K-12, higher ed, community-based organizations, or for-profit business. So there are a lot of national and local resources available on our website as well.
Great, and we'll include that link on that final resource page so you can go and mine through there. Another question that came up it says, I'm just reading here, as you mentioned, service learning and community engagement tends to be a female-dominated field. Does any of your research indicate a significant difference based on gender?
No, and that's, well, I shouldn't say no. What I should say is our sample size was a little small to try to start breaking down into those subgroups. So for us, what we're suggesting an area for future research is to expand the size of the study and be able to look for those nuances between practitioner types. So between, if there's a gender difference, or there are probably, if I had to guess, I wouldn't be surprised if there are further nuanced differences between K-12 practitioners and higher education folks, or between folks who have 1 and 2 years of experience and 10 years of experience.
Mm-hmm.
But we weren't able to see that because our sample size was so small, but I think that'd be a great next step for future research.
Yeah, I think that would be an exciting way for folks to be able to look at how is this research really applicable on a drilled down level, thinking about some of those ways to support, whether it's advanced practitioners, folks in different sectors, K-12, higher ed, et cetera. As you look at some of the results from this research and understanding that it's sort of the beginning of what could be a much more extensive peek into practitioner impacts, how do you see this type of research driving the conversation that I know we've been having at the Campus Compact nationally at that level around professionalization of the service learning and civic engagement field? And I mean, this is beyond instructors, but also to civic engagement professionals that help support those instructors. And do you see that this kind of research could impact some of that conversation around criteria, qualifications, or what does it, who are we attracting, how are we recruiting them, et cetera?
Yeah, it's interesting because, in a couple of weeks, our campus is leading our annual Service Learning Scholars Workshop. And I've been thinking about how do I weave in the findings of this into how we approach training faculty on our particular campus. And I think, it allows me to at least speak, I think, with what I feel like is a greater sense of credibility about what I perceive the benefits of engaging in service learning are, and to faculty who are considering developing a service learning course. And my hope is that it allows us to advocate for service learning on our campuses by seeing what the impacts are, not only on students, and I think in general, what upper administration wants to see is impacts on students. That's vitally important, and we can't, undermine the importance of that. But I do think that it's important to them to recognize what the impact on those who are being asked to or choosing to implement service learning would be. And so I think that it can be supportive in that realm. And then you asked me some other piece of that question that I was going to answer, and now I'm forgetting what it was. Oh, I think you asked about the impact on folks who I assume you're talking about, like me, who work in a center for community engagement and service learning of some kind, and who may or may not teach service learning classes ourselves, who serve as staff functions or support functions for those engaging in service learning. And I do think it could be interesting to do research with those practitioners to see what their idea of impacts and benefits might be on them as staff members who are leading the charge for community engagement on college campuses. I don't know, that's not an area that we looked into when we engaged in the study. We were specifically looking for research and literature that was looking at service learning practitioners. So there might be, but I'm guessing there's probably not a lot of some out there about the impact on staff members who are sort of leading the charge of engagement on their college campuses in terms of impacts on them as individuals as well. So it could be another interesting area for research also.
Yeah, and just as a little plug, I know that Emily Shields at Iowa Campus Compact has done work and recently published around this topic of professionalization, more specifically to community engagement professionals than to instructors. But I think that there are a lot of intersections at which we can look at what does that look like as far as how do you build professionals where it can weave in those impacts in a positive way and be able to be used as a recruitment tool and something that can ensure that there's a good fit for folks that are getting into the field and that they're doing it well, they're reaping the benefits. I mean, all of these things are tied together, but I think there's a lot of ways in which those conversations can be intersected. Going back to a couple of questions, and Cody, this one may be more for you. When you think about the formation of the Colorado Service Learning Council and its impact and power, both in creating connections for this type of research to be possible, and looking at plans moving forward, what does this look like as far as the major goals of the Service Learning Council moving forward? What's sort of the big vision for what the Service Learning Council can do for the state moving forward?
Well, I would say, this is a piece of our advocacy strategy. And one thing that we've really talked about is not just advocating, because, this is all, we all kind of volunteer our time on the Service Learning Council. And one of the big, we don't necessarily have the capacity to be a lobbying organization or to undergo, a lot of advocacy ourselves, but we want to make tools and training available to people to advocate within their institutions for a service learning approach. So this particular study, I think, can be really useful for individuals who are looking to maybe convince their principals or their supervisors or their department to utilize a service learning approach. So I think this, is kind of a key part of our advocacy strategy, which is to help equip individuals throughout the service learning community to be better advocates themselves.
Wonderful, thanks. And so this will be, it sort of ties in here, probably our last question. And it's based on a couple of the different findings that you presented on, and that I'm not sure that they're at odds, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about whether or not they are. The one is the benefit around promotion, tenure, awards, recognition, and how service learning practice can be a positive thing. And then a second one that was not as much time spent on, but regarding relationship with administrators, and that was an area that was listed as more of a challenge for practitioners, if I understood you correctly. So I'm curious if there is a tension there between practitioners feeling like they need to consistently make the case and make sure that their pedagogy and practice is sort of up to snuff and being able to demonstrate impacts. And then on the other hand, the positive piece of, awards and recognition and how that can really be a benefit to them. If you see any tension there at all.
Yeah, well, I do think so. To be like really clear and candid, I think a limitation of this particular research is there was no incentive given to individuals to participate. So those who gave of their time to participate in these interviews are probably strong service learning advocates, right? Mm-hmm. And so we didn't end up with interviews from folks who taught using service learning pedagogy for a while and no longer do for whatever reason. And so I do think an interesting area for further research is to interview those folks who once used service learning but now don't, and figure out why. So I think for us, we probably self-selected in some way people who saw those benefits from service learning. So we did have a couple of faculty talk about feeling like it elevated them in their discipline, and that's their service learning work is why they felt like they got asked to be a keynote speaker at arguably their discipline's largest conference. That led to them getting tenure. And so I do wonder, while we lump those together, I don't know in comparison, folks who choose not to pursue service learning anymore, did it have negative consequences on their things like achieving promotion and tenure? Mm-hmm. We certainly anecdotally in higher education, we hear those stories, or we hear people talk about not pursuing service learning because of the potential impacts it can have on receiving promotion and tenure. So I do think there could be a little bit of skewing based on who participated in our interview process. And then your second question was the tension between that sort of promotion and tenure and those relationships with administration. One individual called those relationships a mixed bag. Like people who get it, and the people who don't. And so it seems relatively common. Like most service learning practitioners talked about either having support from their institutions or most of them didn't talk about any strong sense of animosity or having to like fight an uphill battle, but having administrators who were kind of laissez-faire about like, you know, if you want to do it, great, whatever, I don't really care, sort of an attitude to come from them, rather than sort of that like outright antagonistic approach. But my guess is those individuals are probably the ones who have chosen to stop pursuing service learning and might be less likely to have offered themselves up as interviewees for our interview protocol. So I do think that is a limitation that our research has, is that the pool of folks that we interviewed are probably having positive experiences with service learning. I also think that another area for future research is actually to interview administrators about what they perceive as the impacts and benefits on their faculty, their teachers, as well, to see what their perceptions are. Do they match up with the perceptions that actual practitioners feel? Why are they supportive or not supportive? So some of that as well.
I would just say from a K-12 perspective, also kind of anecdotally, I think by its nature, we know that service learning tends to be much more public than traditional kind of classroom experiences. So, seeing successful projects that have a tangible impact on communities really benefit administrators as well. How a school is perceived by its surrounding community, or how a teacher is perceived by the administrators based on the success of this program, which is much more visible than a lot of traditional pedagogies.
The last thing I'd say too is just that I do find it interesting. I've had a number of faculty who say they find it really interesting that sometimes they're critiqued for their choice to engage in service learning pedagogy when nobody's critiquing their choice to use PowerPoint versus an overhead projector or any other method of teaching that one might pursue. So why is it that they're critiqued for their choice of service learning when they're not critiqued for other choices potentially? And so how do we encourage broader administration to see service learning as a method of a high quality, rigorous academic way of accomplishing learning objectives in a classroom, just like assigning an essay paper might, or choosing to bring in a guest speaker, or any of the other options we might have. So I don't know what that means for research, other than I recognize that seems to be some potential tension there with how administrators view service learning.
Well, it sounds like there's an unlimited wealth of information that is here, but that also is yet to be sort of uncovered. And this is a really awesome launching pad to think more deeply about how we think about practitioners and what those impacts are for them, both in the K-12 system and in higher education. I want to thank both of you for your time today, for the time you've put into development of the Colorado Service Learning Council and this research project in particular. We will again make the recording, the link that will be posted on YouTube, along with this full PowerPoint presentation, including a final page that'll have some additional links and resources for you to dig into. And a link to a very brief evaluation about the webinar. If you could complete that, that would be very handy for us as we continue to pull together content that we hope is relevant and helpful for you at whatever institution or community organization that you're with. Many thanks to you both once again. Thank you for your time if you're a participant, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.